Have you ever noticed how silence can feel louder than words? Every night, he leaves. No explanations, no arguments, just distance. As their anniversary approaches, her questions grow heavier, and her body begins to react in ways she can't explain. Is love fading, or is something deeper being hidden? Ayaka has been married for 10 years, long enough for love to have matured beyond excitement, but not long enough to forget what closeness once felt like. In the early days, she was expressive, emotionally open, someone who believed that sharing even the smallest thoughts was a way of staying connected. Over time, however, something subtle began to shift. There was no dramatic argument, no single moment where everything broke. Instead, an invisible distance slowly formed, almost politely, as if neither of them wanted to acknowledge it. Conversations that once stretched late into the night became brief exchanges about routine. Her husband started going out every evening, returning late with the same calm expression, offering no explanations unless asked, and even then, only just enough to end the question. He wasn't unkind, he wasn't cold, he was simply distant. And that ambiguity, that emotional fog, unsettled Ayaka more than clear rejection ever could. As their wedding anniversary approached, the unease deepened. She noticed a quiet weariness in his tone, a kind of mental absence that made her feel as though she was speaking into a room that echoed but never answered. Ayaka began to ask herself questions she never thought she would need to ask. Was this what long-term love naturally turned into? Or was something slipping away without her noticing? Even at work, her colleagues noticed that her usual warmth had dimmed, replaced by a quiet distraction that never quite left her face. What made it harder was that there was no clear enemy in her story, no obvious wrongdoing, just silence. And silence, in close relationships, can be deeply confusing. It leaves space for interpretation, and the human mind, especially when anxious, tends to fill that space with fear rather than compassion. Ayaka found herself trapped between what she felt and what she could prove, between intuition and uncertainty. And it was in that fragile space where love, doubt, and longing quietly collided that her emotional journey truly began. As days passed, Ayaka's inner world grew louder, even as her external life remained unchanged. On the surface, nothing dramatic was happening. Her husband still spoke to her politely, still shared meals when their schedules aligned, still lived beside her in the same home. Yet psychologically, Ayaka was experiencing what many people do when emotional connection begins to fade, a heightened sensitivity to absence. Every unanswered question, every unexplained routine became magnified in her mind. For Ayaka, the lack of emotional transparency slowly transformed into a quiet sense of threat, not because she knew something was wrong, but because she didn't know anything at all. At the same time, her body began to react. Unexplained allergic symptoms appeared, sudden and persistent, with no clear cause. Ayaka didn't see it that way at first. She only knew she felt uncomfortable, unsettled, and increasingly exhausted. Her husband, on the other hand, appeared calm, reserved, yes, but consistent. Ayaka tried to ask gentle questions, hoping for reassurance rather than answers. But his responses were brief, carefully worded, as if he were protecting something, not necessarily hiding it, but keeping it contained. Ayaka didn't accuse or confront. Instead, she turned inward. She began to doubt her own needs, wondering if wanting more connection was unreasonable after 10 years of marriage. This kind of self-doubt is common in long-term relationships, especially for individuals who value emotional closeness. Rather than seeing her longing as a signal, she treated it as a flaw. Her physical symptoms worsened. The allergic reactions became more frequent, appearing at unpredictable times. Ayaka's fatigue deepened, her sleep became restless, and her thoughts circled the same questions again and again. What's important here is that neither person was acting with harmful intent. Ayaka was seeking safety and reassurance. Her husband, in his own way, was maintaining boundaries he believed were protective. Yet between them, something essential was missing: shared emotional context. Without it, both were isolated in different ways. At work, she performed her duties, but her presence felt thinner, as if part of her attention was always elsewhere. As the anniversary drew closer, Ayaka felt an internal pressure building. Not anger, but a quiet desperation to understand what was happening to her life, her marriage, and herself. When emotional uncertainty lingers too long, it doesn't stay gentle. It accumulates. And eventually, it demands to be acknowledged. Ayaka realized she could no longer carry the weight of her thoughts alone. Not because she wanted to accuse or demand, but because uncertainty had quietly worn her down. That day, she spoke not with frustration, but with honesty. She shared how the distance had affected her, how the silence had made her feel unseen, how her body and mind seemed to be reacting to a fear she couldn't name. From a therapeutic perspective, this was a critical shift. She wasn't asking for explanations. She was expressing experience. And that distinction matters. When people feel safe enough to describe their inner world without blame, it creates space for truth rather than defense. Her husband. For a long moment, he said nothing. But this silence felt different. It wasn't evasive. It was reflective. Then, he explained what he had never known how to say. The evenings away, the emotional withdrawal, the secrecy, none of it had been about distance from her. In fact, it had been shaped by concern for her. He had been involved in an animal rescue group, dedicating his time to helping abandoned animals recover and find safety. But he also knew Ayaka's allergies were severe. He worried that sharing this part of his life would cause her anxiety or physical discomfort. So he made a decision, imperfect but well-intentioned, to keep it separate, believing that silence was a form of protection. He hadn't forgotten their anniversary. On the contrary, he had been planning something quiet and thoughtful, something that aligned with his values and his affection for her. When all misunderstandings were resolved, Ayaka realized that sometimes silence doesn't stem from distance, but from a desire to protect those one loves. At that moment, she was overwhelmed with emotion, Not sadness, but understanding and connection rediscovered.